Western leaders have condemned a decision by the Russian President Vladimir Putin to recognize two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as independent states. Putin agreed to requests from the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. In a wide-ranging speech in the last hour, the Russian leader has accused Ukrainian forces of shelling civilian areas. He also says NATO has ignored Russia's concerns and rejected its security demands. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has told Putin the decision to recognize the breakaway regions breaches the 2015 Minsk peace accords. Ukraine has appealed to the United Nations for help. DW correspondent Nick Connolly is in Kiev and can now tell us a little bit more. Nick, how has the Ukrainian government reacted to President Putin's decision?
Well, I think this was a move that people hadn't seen coming all along. Russia's strategy had been to try and force Ukraine to reintegrate those separatist-controlled areas, to turn those Russian-backed separatists into Ukrainian politicians as a way for Moscow to guarantee its influence over Ukraine, as to give a veto over Ukraine's aspirations and attempts to draw closer with NATO and the EU. So basically, by recognizing those self-proclaimed territories, basically that is dead. The Minsk peace process is dead, because that was all about bringing these territories back into the Ukrainian fold. Pretty difficult to see, if not impossible to see, how that could now happen given that recognition. We've heard that Russia is also going to draw up various kinds of agreements on cooperation with those regions. Speculation now that that would mean military cooperation, maybe even Russian troops being stationed there to protect those territories at the request of their separatist leaders. That would obviously put Russian troops very close to Ukrainian soldiers along that 400-kilometer line, 400-kilometer long front between Ukrainian-controlled territory and separatist-held territory that basically has been stuck and has not moved much since 2015, even though the fighting and the shooting has continued. Definitely a sense here that this is Moscow and the Kremlin raising the stakes.
Nick, as you well know, Washington has been worried that Putin would use this recognition as a pretext to send forces into the region, the argument being that he's protecting ethnic Russians in an independent state. What are they saying in Kiev about that?
Well, that's definitely the worry. We've heard warnings from Washington and London in recent days about Russia potentially planning false flag operations, any kind of situation which could be used to accuse Ukraine of committing some kinds of crimes or some kind of attacks on civilians as a pretext for Russian intervention. We've even heard Vladimir Putin and top Russian officials in recent days accusing Ukraine of genocide in eastern Ukraine. Then these reports today of Ukrainian spies allegedly, according to the Russians, trying to get onto Russian territory. Russia saying that it was able to kill those spies on Russian territory and destroy their vehicles. No evidence provided of that so far. So definitely a worry that this is all an attempt to try and create some kind of pretext, at least for a Russian domestic audience, for military action against Ukraine. Russia has also handed out almost 1 million Russian passports to people living in Donetsk and Luhansk, so it always has that excuse of going in to protect not only ethnic Russians but Russian passport holders. Very nervous time here, and a sense that this crisis, after months of building up, is now moving into a new phase.
Nick Connolly in Kiev. Many thanks, Nick. We can cross to Brussels now and speak to our correspondent there, Christine Munwa. Christine, what is the EU's reaction likely to be now that President Putin has recognized the two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine?
That is the million-dollar question, Michael. When EU foreign ministers convened their meeting at 9 a.m. this morning here in Brussels, nobody could have told you that we would be getting the news of President Vladimir Putin acknowledging the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk. In a press briefing after the Foreign Affairs meeting, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell said that he hoped that President Putin wouldn't take that step, but in the event that he did, that there would be a united response. And that essentially echoes what we've heard from the EU chief, Ursula von der Leyen. I'll quote her here. She says, the EU and its partners will react with unity, firmness, and with determination in solidarity with Ukraine. Very little on what that reaction is going to be. I can tell you there are differing views on that because of the different interests and the positions of member states in the EU. They have different ideas about how to be dealing with Moscow. For example, in today's meeting, the Ukrainian foreign minister was an invited guest, and he urged the European Union to already impose sanctions now on Russia. Of course, the bloc has taken a united decision not to do that, to wait rather for an invasion before any sanctions are triggered. But there are some EU member states, particularly the Balkan states, those that are closer geographically to Russia, who feel that there needs to be a stronger reaction now, even before a classic invasion, as you could put it. Countries like Lithuania, for example, who want a bigger NATO deployment on the eastern flank. So it's going to be interesting what kind of reaction the EU is going to decide on. What is it going to classify this recognition as? It's certainly perhaps not the invasion that some EU member states would like to see before there is an invasion. So what exactly are they going to be doing about that? You will have some member states calling for strong reaction to this, and some member states who will be insisting on being calm and waiting for that invasion before any such sanctions, harsh sanctions, are taken.
Thank you so much. DW correspondent Christine Munwa in Brussels. Western leaders say Putin's move to recognize the breakaway republics as independent amounts to a breach of international law. The decision raises big questions over the 2015 Minsk peace accords.
Reminders of war are everywhere in Donetsk and Luhansk. The two provinces lie in eastern Ukraine on the border with Russia. Both declared independence after the revolution in 2014, which most in the region did not support. Separatists voted to join Russia and have fought Ukrainian forces for control ever since. Around 4 million people live in what's called the Donbas region. It's known for heavy industry and coal mining, and its large Russian and Russian-speaking population. In the main city, Donetsk, banners read, "We are Russian." Moscow has handed out hundreds of thousands of Russian passports. But life is tough, caught in the middle. Many who can have left. Most pensioners are stuck. Others fight. Ukraine estimates there are around 35,000 separatist troops and accuses Moscow of filling out their ranks with Russian soldiers. In 2015, a ceasefire signed in Minsk helped end full-scale fighting. But the conflict has dragged on, leaving more than 14,000 people dead. And with the West accusing Moscow of preparing to invade Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk are on high alert again. Men of fighting age have been drafted. Women and children are evacuating to Russia. And soldiers on the front lines watch and wait.
Let's go to our political correspondent Thomas Sparrow here in Berlin. Thomas, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke to President Putin earlier today and warned him against recognizing the independence of the Ukraine breakaway regions. Does this reflect a complete failure of diplomatic efforts?
I wouldn't describe it as a complete failure of diplomatic efforts, but it's certainly a big blow to efforts that Germany and other countries tried to bring forward in the last few weeks, especially in discussions with Russia to try and ease this situation, to try and solve the situation diplomatically and politically. It's important to stress that Germany, but also France, have specifically focused on what's called the Normandy format, which was actually started in 2014, which then helped broker the so-called Minsk agreements. And now German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is precisely describing that this recognition by Russia would be a one-sided breach of precisely those agreements, the goal of which was to end the war in eastern Ukraine. So it is certainly, undoubtedly, a very difficult situation also for Germany and for France as well in their efforts to try and bring this situation to a political and diplomatic end. it's also important to stress that this has been one of the two sides of Germany's strategy towards Russia in this particular context. On the one hand, stressing that negotiations are absolutely key to end this conflict. On the other hand, stressing that if negotiations are not successful, then Germany will act hand in hand with its political partners in the EU and in NATO to sanction Russia. And it's this second aspect, this second point, which will now be very interesting to follow. What exactly will happen? Will the EU show that unity that is necessary to bring sanctions forward? What role will Olaf Scholz have in all this? Will he still continue focusing on diplomatic solutions? Will he still continue focusing on dialogue with Russia? Will he at the same time support sanctions coming from the EU? So certainly very important moments now, and for Germany in particular, a very difficult situation, especially when it comes to its focus on a diplomatic solution based on these so-called Normandy dialogues, which then helped broker the Minsk agreements.
And now let's get the U.S. reaction from Oliver Salet in Washington, D.C. Oliver, what are you hearing from that end?
Well, President Biden called his national security team to come together. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor of the president, issued a stark warning on an attack earlier today. He said that it would be a war on the Ukrainian people and that the Russian President Vladimir Putin would crush them, quote unquote, and harm them, and that it could be extremely violent, this war. And that is basically the concern here in Washington. President Biden will then be able to say, look, this is exactly what I predicted. We've heard warnings coming out of the White House for days and weeks that Vladimir Putin has been looking for a reasoning to create a pretext for war, and that by doing this and by the speech that we just heard created a framework for a subsequent invasion. Another concern, of course, here in Washington is that it's not only about an invasion on Ukrainian soil, which of course is considered an independent country and therefore would be a breach of international law, but it's also about neighboring Belarus, where Russia stationed lots of troops, a country with bordering with three NATO allies. So it's not only about Ukraine, it is about the broader security architecture in Europe.
Oliver, as you well know, there's been talk about a last-minute bid for a summit between Biden and Putin. Is that still likely to happen?
Well, that really depends on what happens next and how far the Russians will go. First of all, the big question here is how to move on. And there have been threats of massive sanctions coming from the White House. And it all depends on how far Russia will go. President Biden, in speeches earlier, mentioned that if Putin, for instance, decides to just attack the separatist control areas or to integrate them and to send his troops there, the sanctions would be lesser than an attack on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Of course, there is certainly still an effort to keep the diplomatic path going.
Oliver Salet in Washington, D.C. Many thanks, Ollie. Ukrainians around the world are, of course, keeping a nervous eye on developments. DW Washington correspondent Oliver Salet, who you just heard from, spoke to one Ukrainian citizen living in the U.S. who's worried he might lose his homeland.
He may be 5,000 miles away, but Vitaly Desyatchenko is still close to his homeland, Ukraine.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. Did everything come out all right?
A manager in New York's Vazelka restaurant, the crisis back home is the #1 topic for him and his colleagues.
It worries me a lot. It's not the easiest thing to go through, and getting all those pieces of news every day does not help one to have a good day. I'm very worried, I'm very concerned. Now they say that some things might actually happen anytime soon. And some days I cannot just sleep right.
New York City's East Village is home to the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. An estimated 80,000 people here have Ukrainian roots. The neighborhood hosts a Ukrainian bank, a school, and several restaurants. Vitaly has been living in the U.S. for some years, a country that gives him more opportunities, but above all, security, he says. His biggest concern are his parents back home in Kiev.
Maybe because we only have one child and he's not living with us in Ukraine, that is why we are staying calm. I don't know how we would feel if our son was in Ukraine. Maybe we would have to worry every second.
Outside the UN, members of the Ukrainian community demand tougher sanctions against Russia.
We cannot rely on sanctions that were passed 7-8 years ago to turn the tide of Russia. Russia is used to those sanctions. Russia has now changed its financial structure to actually have more financial reserves under sanctions than before. We need new sanctions. We need them now, not after.
Stop Putin now!
Many here are growing frustrated with how the situation has deteriorated in recent weeks.
It's terrifying. We're going to lose our home country.
We don't trust any words of Putin. We just want to see on facts, and then we will believe that troops are going back.
Russia should keep in their territory and leave Ukraine to be in a way that Ukraine desires to be, free country, independent country.
Vitaly and his colleagues remain hopeful that diplomacy will eventually prevail.
You guys good to order? I need a couple more minutes.
As they are far away and yet so close to their homeland, Ukraine.